Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Dwight Eisenhower, and the focus is Supreme Commander, North Africa. The year is 1942. Ike has just been named a lieutenant general. He's now responsible for all of U.S. Army forces in Europe here in World War II, and he put his team together, starting with his good friend Mark Clark in charge of Army ground forces. Major General Carl Spaatz was put in charge of the Army Air Corps. Major General John Lee responsible for logistics, and Ike needed a really strong chief of staff. So he went to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall and says, I'd like to pluck Brigadier General Walter Bedell Smith out of your office and bring him to Europe as my chief of staff. Now, Smith was a foul-mouthed, addicted to duty kind of guy, but he was willing to do whatever it took, including the tough jobs. When he took over as chief of staff, he said, look, I was just Ike's Pratt boy. Ike always had to have a Pratt boy, someone to do the dirty work for him. He always had to be someone else who did the firing or the reprimanding or give any orders which he knew people would find unpleasant to carry out. Ike always has to be the nice guy, created a good job for Smith, who was very good at his responsibilities. There was one other nice guy in the inner circle for Dwight Eisenhower, and that was Harry Butcher, who was really his friend, a publicity man in the United States, but he donned a naval uniform and became Ike's naval aide, mainly his companion during his stay in Europe. And there was one other member of his internal team there, his driver. He wanted that young woman, Kay Summersby, who had driven for him his last time in Europe. Well, maybe she could drive for him again. He looked around. Turned out she was driving for General Carl Spaatz. That came to an end. For the rest of the war, Kay Summersby would be by the side of Dwight Eisenhower. Now, there were new rules of the road that Ike put in place. People were expected to work 7 days a week. You were expected to work hard, exhausting hours. This was not easy work under Eisenhower. As General Lucius Clay said, General Eisenhower was not the easiest person in the world to work for. He'd give you a job, and when you completed it, he'd give you another. The more you did, the more he asked. If you did not measure up, you were gone. He had no tolerance for failure. He also had no tolerance for pessimism. People who were complainers. You were going to be optimistic in Ike's headquarters, or you also were going to be shipped out. Now, Ike's now the senior officer for the United States in this war over in Europe. Everybody wanted to meet him. The British kind of laid out the red carpet, including Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who started meeting with Ike twice a week. In fact, he would often spend weekends at the Prime Minister's residence called Chequers. And over time, actually rather quickly, Churchill made the comment, we talked all our affairs over back and forth as if we were all one country. I set great value on these personal contacts. I soon began to call him Ike. This was one of the main reasons that Ike was picked, the ability to have those interpersonal relationships, not just on the military side, but also on the political side. In this sense, he was off to a good start. Maybe not so much on the military side, because his first encounter with one of the senior commanders of the British, General Bernard Montgomery, everybody called Monty, didn't go very well. Ike went to visit Monty's headquarters, and Monty turned around and smelled smoke. And it turns out he doesn't allow smoking in his headquarters. And of course, Ike is a chain smoker, 3-4 packs a day. He was the offender, and he calmly put out his cigarette, but he got in his car and he was livid over sort of the rudeness of General Montgomery. According to Kay Summersby, it was my first exposure to the Eisenhower temper. I sneaked a look in the rearview mirror. His face was flaming red. The veins in his forehead looked like worms. The relationship between the two men never got any better. In fact, as the war progressed, Monty's self-righteousness and rigidity often had the general actually gasping in anger. It would be one of the most difficult relationships for Eisenhower throughout the entire course of the war. Now, the strategy was still at issue between the British and the Americans. Where were they going to try to attack the Germans? Now, the Americans were continuing to advocate for a cross-channel invasion of France, or the shortest distance to get to the Germans, but the British were adamant. They were not ready for this. They didn't have enough men, not enough ships, not enough planes, not enough supplies, not going to happen. And so where were they going to go? Because Franklin Roosevelt was adamant. It is of the highest importance that U.S. ground troops be brought into action against the enemy in 1942. No stalling here. We got to get on the ground, build morale. So what did the British recommend? North Africa campaign. In North Africa, the Germans in General Erwin Rommel and his robust tanks and the Afrika Korps were already marching toward the Middle East. They had already defeated the British in Libya. They were marching toward Egypt, and their goal was to get control of the Suez Canal and the Middle East oil, which if they got their hands on that, it could change the calculus of the entire war. So the British had sent Montgomery into Egypt to try to start pushing the Germans back, maybe into that northeast corner of Africa in Tunisia. And now the idea was, let's land the Americans in North Africa, in Morocco, for example, or Algeria. They would push east from there toward Tunisia, while Montgomery is pushing north. They would catch Rommel in a vice and eventually evict all the Germans from North Africa, preserve Middle East oil. That was the plan. Okay, they called it Operation Torch. The question was, who's going to lead it? Now, originally, the idea was, at least a lot of people thought, when Eisenhower took over in Europe, people thought this was temporary until the real fighting started, particularly if there was going to be a cross-channel invasion, that Army Chief of Staff George Marshall would resign that position, come over to Europe, and lead the battle. But not for North Africa. They weren't going to do that. So Marshall was certainly staying at this point in Washington. It was suggested when the Combined Chiefs of Staff got together by Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations for the U.S., look, you got Eisenhower here, let him run it. Well, the whole shebang, as we talked about in the last episode, just got a whole bunch bigger for Dwight Eisenhower because he had never done anything like this before. Lead a large command in battle in a theater of war. Again, his principal skills had been as a staff officer, but he was there, they gave him confidence, and Dwight Eisenhower was named the Supreme Commander in charge of Torch. Now, this was going to be a touchy situation, not just from a military standpoint, but also political because of the French. The French actually were, Morocco and Algeria were French colonies at the time. The difficulty was the Germans, of course, had invaded France, kicked out the French government, and established a new government in collaboration with the Germans in the town of Vichy. And the Vichy government had given instructions to the military, the French military in North Africa, to defend against any attack by the Allies. Now, Eisenhower was aware of this. He's trying to think to himself, how do I deal with the French and the control of North Africa even after we invade? That was one of his big issues. The other was where to land. The goal, again, was Tunisia. So they thought they would have 3 major landing spots in North Africa. 2 of them would be in Algeria. That would be in Oran and in Algiers. The third spot they were thinking was Bonn, which was actually the closest, only about 50 miles away from the Tunisian border. But Ike was concerned about this. He thought the risk was too high. German submarines posed a big problem in that area. Also, flights from the German Air Force coming over from Sicily or Italy put Bonn in an exposure spot. So he said, look, we're going to not land there. We'll land in Oran and Algiers. And then over on the western side in Casablanca, in Morocco, would be the third landing spot. This is one of the first big decisions that Ike made, and it would be an issue in terms of actually then executing the battle plan going forward, but this is where we start. Ike was working round the clock in London planning for this entire operation, and Harry Butcher said, look, Ike, you got to get some rest. So he found a spot that was called Telegraph Cottage, just a small 3-bedroom, also a little oasis, far enough away from headquarters, but close enough that he could still get there at any time. This is where Ike would finally get a little relaxation in his evenings. He would have dinner, he'd have drinks with his close colleagues. They would play some very serious games of bridge, which was something very common for Eisenhower, and he took, again, very seriously. Only his closest colleagues were there, his true family inner circle for the military, but that included Kay Summersby, his driver, who didn't stay at Telegraph Cottage, but she was there basically every evening. Eventually, Ike told her that, I don't think I ever have in my life felt so much at ease with any other human being or felt so much at home as I did at Telegraph Cottage. Ike then decided to get a dog with Kay. A Scottish Terrier is what they picked out. They did it together, and he named the dog Telek. T-E-L-E-K. For others who asked about the name, he said, well, it's a military secret. To Kay, he said, it's a combination of Telegraph Cottage and Kay, 2 parts of my life that make me very happy. Well, Ike spent a lot of time, again, focusing on the role of the French and what was going to happen after they landed in North Africa. And for this, he had a diplomat by the name of Frank Murphy, who was kind of guiding him. He was familiar with the area, and he was recommending that Ike align himself with General Henri Giraud, who had recently escaped, a French general who recently escaped from a German prison camp, and he thought that the French would rally around Giraud once the Americans and British landed in North Africa. Well, Ike transferred his operational headquarters to Gibraltar, the Rock, just before it was time to engage in this fight, and that's where he was going to meet Giraud. But before he could do that, he actually had a moment of reflection, thinking of his role at Gibraltar, which had been for centuries a key element of defending that portion of the Mediterranean. He made the observation, war brings about strange, sometimes ridiculous situations. One I now could never have, under any circumstances, have entered in my mind, even fleetingly. I have operational command of Gibraltar, the symbol of the solidity of the British Empire, the hallmark of safety and security at home, the jealously guarded rock that has played a tremendous part in the trade development of the English race. An American is in charge, and I am he. A brief moment of reflection. But then it was time to meet with Giraud, with Mark Clark, and it did not go well. They spent almost 8 hours together trying to get Giraud to buy into their plans for the operation, and Giraud kept saying, look, I'll participate, but I have to be in complete charge, which was, of course, a non-starter. So when it was time to actually start the invasion the next day on November the 9th of 1942, Giraud was sitting on the sidelines with Ike in Gibraltar. The force was about 116,000 men, about 2/3 of American, about 1/3 British. The American troops, most of them seeing action for the first time. Many of them were draftees, had never fought in battle before. There were about 400 ships storming toward those 3 main beach areas in North Africa, and the results on day 1 were a little mixed. In Algiers, there was basically no resistance at all. An armistice was set by noon. Good start for the Americans and British there. But in the other 2 landing spots, the French were defending their territory like they had been told. Giraud actually agreed to go into North Africa, and it turned out he was basically useless. Nobody was responding to him at all. So the key player was Admiral Jean-Louis Francois Darlan, who was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces for the French in North Africa. Now, he was extremely controversial. He was virulently anti-British. He had been a collaborator with the Germans, but Ike even saw him as what he called a deep-dyed villain. But he was the man on the ground, and he figured he had to work with him. Well, the key thing that changed for Darlan, who initially resisted the Allied landings, was from Adolf Hitler. Hitler canceled the armistice with the Vichy government in France over what was going on in North Africa. Well, that freed up Darlan in his mind to make a deal with these invaders, and he met with Mark Clark, and they came up with the Clark-Darlan Agreement, which told the French forces to stand down and that civil control of the government in North Africa would go to Darlan. Now, Ike was actually thrilled about this. It took only 3 days to settle the entire matter. Each side had about 3,000 men in casualties, but that was considered relatively light to take control of North Africa. So Ike's very excited to put that behind him, ready to go face the Germans, but the political folks actually exploded. Roosevelt, Churchill, they couldn't stand Darlan. This was like doing a deal with the devil, and with the big hullabaloo over this, Ike actually thought he was going to be fired. One of his first major decisions, and he was going to be canned over it, but he made the case. Look, we can't fight the Germans if we're also fighting the French behind us. We had to make this deal, and even Roosevelt reluctantly agreed to a temporary agreement with Darlan to be in charge, so Eisenhower could then turn to Tunisia, because he had to get there before Hitler could bring in reinforcements, and this was going to be a bit of a race. Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson was the first of the Allies to arrive right near Tunisia, and he was soundly defeated by Rommel's Tiger tanks and those 88mm guns and the strafing from the German Air Force. This was also starting of the rainy season in North Africa, and the roads, which were not very good in the first place, all turned to mud. Neither side was able to move. This was incredibly frustrating, trying to get the fight off the ground for Dwight Eisenhower, who said to Kay, "It's bad. We weren't prepared for these rains, this mud. Our officers don't have the experience, don't know how to handle their men or their weapons." He decided to take a trip to the front because this stall was going on now for several days, and he was even more frustrated when he got to the front. A lot of the people were pointing their fingers at Eisenhower. He was a mistake not to land at Bonn. It was a mistake not to get his troops to Tunisia even faster. One of the biggest critics was General Sir Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff of the British, who said Eisenhower seemed unable to grasp the urgency of pushing on to Tunis before the Germans built up the resistance there. It must be remembered that Eisenhower had never even commanded a battalion in action when he found himself commanding a group of armies in North Africa. No wonder he was at a loss of what to do. I had little confidence in his having the ability to handle the military situation confronting him, and he caused me great anxiety. So again, there were finger pointing about this stall going on in and around Tunisia. Ike, as I said, had gone to the front, but he didn't stay there very long because he got a call around Christmas time in 1942 that Darlan had been assassinated. He needed to hurry back and try to solve that mess because control for the French now was up for grabs. Roosevelt and Churchill decided to see things things for themselves. They showed up in Casablanca, and they basically dealt with the French, with both Giraud and also General Charles de Gaulle. Now, de Gaulle also claiming to be in charge. He and Giraud were somewhat rivals. De Gaulle had been living in exile in Britain, claimed he was the leader of the Free French movement. Franklin Roosevelt couldn't stand de Gaulle. That didn't make things any easier, but they came up with an arrangement where Giraud and de Gaulle would sort of share responsibilities, mainly so that Eisenhower didn't have to worry about the civilian control issue. Ike also made a couple of changes in his team. He elevated 3 Brits to be his direct reports in this combined campaign. Eisenhower's view of coalition warfare was to have Brits report to Americans, or Americans report to Brits, try to break down some of those natural barriers. February of 1943, the roads were finally passable, and this fight is finally going to get going, and it was the Germans who took the aggression. They came out from behind their lines at Kasserine Pass and actually pushed the Americans back. But by this point, over the winter, the Americans had overloaded the system with trucks and tanks and personnel and planes coming in, and all of a sudden they had so much mass that the Germans simply couldn't resist. It took a couple of months, but by May the 8th, the key airfields in Tunis were in Allied hands. 250,000 of the enemy surrendered, and on May the 20th of 1943, they had a grand parade in Tunis to celebrate this victory. Eisenhower said, "I could never have believed it possible ever to dream of such an honor as to command an army like this." Sure, some mistakes had been made, but the mission was accomplished. North Africa was completely in the hands of the Allies, and they were already thinking about what's next. And that's the story for another day. That's Dwight Eisenhower and Supreme Commander North Africa from the life of Dwight Eisenhower. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.